We've got the pleasure this morning of listening and working with Jill Goldsmith. Jill has been a lawyer for 25 years, a graduate of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at ASU, and she then took a turn in her career after 25 years as a litigator, both nationally and internationally. And decided to go into counseling and teaching. So she is a licensed counselor and a national certified counselor as well. She's also got certification in emotional intelligence and those kinds of functions that actually we probably should have had Jill on the panel this morning talking about tough issues with judges. She was here and listened to all of it, and so I think we can use her expertise not only now, but hopefully maybe in the future. So Jill?
Good morning, and thank you for hanging in with us this morning, and we're at the home stretch. Also thank you for the fact that I have a bit of a cold, so I might not speak with the loudest of voices. But anyways, as you heard, I was a trial attorney for 25 years before returning to school and switching careers and getting both leadership development training as well as a master's in counseling. But I'm going to take you back about a decade when I was a partner in the Phoenix office of a national law firm. We had offices coast to coast. So the head of the national office calls me one day and he says, so Jill, we got a problem with the Phoenix office. The partners don't really like each other much, and there seems to be more interest in competing with each other than with opposing counsel. And our clients expect us to collaborate, but it seems like people are working in silos there, which of course I knew because I was in the Phoenix office. And he said, so I've called you, I would like you to be managing partner of the Phoenix office. But some open disclosure, because it is a partnership, you actually have no authority over your partners. So you won't be setting salaries or hiring or firing. And you also need to know that I can't pay you anything more, and you still have to keep all of your other billable hours and administrative duties. So as he described this opportunity, I'm kind of thinking, gosh, who signs up for this? Manage a bunch of people who don't report to me? I can't make them do anything. What's the point here? And in fact, the only difference between my partners and I, if I accepted this assignment, was that I'd be held accountable for the morale in the office, productivity, and overall office environment. And I thought about it, and I said, no, thank you. I said, Jesus Christ can't fix this mess, and I'm not Jesus. I don't want this assignment. So as I tried to resist, he said, listen, Jill, the bar is so low that anything you can do would make a difference. So I thought about it, and I said, well, okay, if I can do just one thing during the next 2 years, it would make the environment in which I worked better. So I agreed to do it, although albeit reluctantly. But it was actually my hope that during my 2-year stint that I could persuade them to put all of their oars in the water and row in the same direction. But I had an uphill battle, particularly since this firm was not a typical firm. It was a boutique trial firm. Everybody is either a litigator, trial lawyer. We had a tiger as a mascot, for real. And the motto was, we try the toughest cases anywhere and everywhere. So I had a tough bunch. Also, all of the other equity partners were male. More challenging was that one of them wanted the job that was given to me. And I'll tell you in a bit about how I handled that. But in contrast to my opportunity, it seems that most, but perhaps not all of you, actually signed up for this kind of a gig. Don't know why, but you did it either knowing or perhaps not that you wouldn't actually have much authority over the folks that you were going to be trying to lead or influence. As if you were a presiding judge, perhaps you were measured in the past by the number of cases you got resolved, the speed with which decisions were made, and the public's perception of you. But measuring yourself by those standards today, as presiding judge, can't do that, and you can't engage in all of the same behaviors as you could have in your prior role. In other words, the kinds of strategies you might have used as a lawyer to win cases or decide cases as a presiding judge are generally not go-to strategies when trying to achieve cooperation and move things in a certain direction, especially since you're working with organizations, a lot of other organizations that you have no control over. Same thing for the court administrators who are here. You may have started your career in management, public administration, or as lawyers. You were probably used to a more hierarchical system that everyone agreed to and understood when it came to getting things done. So again, your go-to strategies in the past can really harm your leadership abilities now. So perhaps for many of you, leadership looked like this. You were used to organizations where you had somebody at the top and it was obvious, and that's true for most businesses and governments and law firms. And sometimes, in these kinds of situations, leaders are viewed as leading from the top. And those folks, or here's another one, leading from the front. Whether you're leading from the top or the front, you'll have some tools in your tool belt, such as using salaries, hiring and firing, to get people on board with your ideas or ask them to get off the bus, so to speak. Those kinds of rewards and punishments and commands get people to act. But you folks work in a completely different environment. You have spheres of influence. And these are just some of them that I put up on this slide. In your role, you have to influence, persuade and lead others who have varying degrees of autonomy, yet connection to your court system. You have your line judges, your court administrators, you have the funders of the court systems, just to name a few. So in your role, you might need to influence or lead others who are not dependent upon you for much, if anything. For example, some of them you might be trying to lead people who actually influence how much money you get each year. So I think of this model when I think about you folks and how you must lead and from where you must lead, leading from the middle. And I know there was some talk about that in this conference as well. But I really envision your leadership model like leading from the middle of an interconnected group of people and organizations. And truly, effective leadership really is, in any event at its core, an influence relationship that's not coercive, and it really is multi-directional. So whether you were leading in the kind of role you have now, or frankly in any leadership role, thinking of yourself as the middle of an interconnected group really makes sense. You set a vision or a direction, and then work with and among people in an effective way to achieve your mutually agreed upon goals. It doesn't mean that you will never use something that sounds a bit coercive. I heard some of that during this conference. But in general, your leadership is powerless unless you can find ways to effectively influence and persuade others to implement decisions, facilitate change, and accomplish your goals. So your current role is largely about using soft power skills, personal characteristics and interpersonal relationships and behaviors, strategies and tools. So today I'm going to talk to you about these steps and strategies and some real grab-and-go tips that you can think about implementing as you leave here today or in the future. And I recognize that as I give you these tips and tools, that this is a very broad audience. We've heard that some of you folks lead a system, a court system, where all the judges are down the hall. Some are in the same building, and some are spread out amongst multiple court buildings and hundreds of miles. So you'll need to tailor what I'm talking about to your particular court system. And you also need to tailor this to your personal style. And I am going to talk a bit about personal style. But the fact is my senior partner who had called me and asked me for this gig, he used to walk in court like this. And he used to stand and talk like this. Well, I'd look like an idiot if I did that. So I suggest that as you take these tips and tricks in, that you think about what is your style, what makes sense. So my goal today is to identify those strategies and tailor them to you. So let's get started with that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is self-awareness, emotional intelligence, then relationship building and networking. In that, I'm going to be specific about talking regarding your buddies, your acquaintances, and your critics. And then effective and strategic communication skills and some specific other strategies for effectiveness. And I will tell you that, quite frankly, many of these topics could be the subject of an entire hour itself. But I also know we're going to get out of here by 12:15 or shortly thereafter, so I'll give you just some in each of these areas. So the first thing is self-awareness. The starting point in any leadership development is self-awareness. Because until you really understand your strengths and your blind spots and areas where you can grow, you really can't make changes. So it's really important that you both understand what's going on inside as well as how others perceive you. So to put it another way, you can't, what you don't recognize, you can't manage. So we're first going to start with that inward-focused analysis. Learning to recognize your own emotions, biases, triggers, that sort of thing. So you need to know yourself. So throughout perhaps a 2-week period, you might actually take a notepad and take notes. When does my jaw clench? When does my neck get kind of tense or a knot in my stomach? What's going on? Is it the particular person I'm speaking to? Is it the environment in which I'm speaking? When is it that I feel kind of out of sorts? And jot some notes down. And if you do that and identify what's going on and then your thoughts and feelings around it, you'll start to see some patterns. And I know that's hard to be jotting notes down for 2 weeks, but you'll start seeing those patterns. It could be something like when I'm talking to Bob, I just get so upset inside. Or when I get a bunch of emails in the morning, I just start reacting rather than respond effectively, that sort of thing. And so the goal is not to have you stop feeling that way because you're going to feel that way, but it's to, or even to analyze it to death. But I do want you to think about becoming more conscious when your blood pressure is rising, when the volume of your voice is going up, so that you can start taking steps to manage your behavior. So the other one is outward focused. How do others perceive you? And I know I was hearing this morning that the judges, of course, a lot of line judges are actually filmed in the courtroom, and so you can go back and look at that. And you folks really don't have that opportunity in this role. But it is very important for you to understand how others see your behavior. Perhaps you've stepped into a situation and you think that your behavior is coming across as helping someone, but in fact they found you to be domineering, demanding, or abrasive without your understanding that. So just as it's critical to understand what's going on inside, you need to get some feedback from colleagues, friends, and others about how others perceive you so that you can start taking steps to adjust your style so that your style reflects your intentions. So here's a few examples. First of all, what do they hear? Volume. For some people, the volume is too high, too loud. For others, it's too soft. It also could be the tone of your voice. Is it shrill or shrill only at a certain time? So both are going to be, whether it's loud or soft, really do hamper your ability to be effective because people either can't or don't want to hear you. Are you a pit bull who won't let go of an idea? If you care more about being right and winning than leading, it will derail your career. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But for now, just remember Kenny Rogers' advice. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, and know when to walk away. Do you speak more than anyone else in the room? Less is often more, and especially if it's well-timed. But if you talk too much, you really can alienate others. Do you over-explain? This is a style that's used for people who feel less assertive. So when they want to get a point across, they will talk and talk and talk, or they'll ask questions rather than simply putting out their idea. But that can also be difficult, and it's an ineffective speaking style, especially for leaders. And then silence. Silence can be either good or bad. Silence is good if you're pausing to let people take something in. But silence can also be an indication that you have nothing to contribute, or you're not actually present. So think about using silence as an actual tool, but using it effectively. And then what do they see? Are you present or distracted? Do other people see that you're completely disinterested except when you're talking? So in other words, do you have your cell phone and you're looking at it and put it down only when you're speaking? If you do that, people will stop listening to you. So it's something to notice. So if your goal is to influence or persuade, it is key and critical to ditch the distractions. Eye contact. I think there were some folks, or there was one example even from this morning where some judge was getting problematic reviews because he was always looking down at his notes. Other times, leaders I've worked with, some of them don't recognize that they look at the ceiling when they're speaking to people. It happens without their awareness. In the US, generally, eye contact is important if you want to be persuasive and lead. In other areas of the world, it can be considered disrespectful, but here, eye contact is important. Do you interrupt others? That's obvious. And then do you show your strong emotions, such as anger and frustration? So, embrace the feedback. I always say all data is good. It's not a personal attack. It's a gift. It's really important that you notice how people are responding to you. Do they have their arms folded? Are they nodding in agreement? Or do they seem angry? When you're walking down the hall, do people say, hey, what's wrong? When in fact, actually nothing's wrong. Ask them, why are you picking up on that? Because unless you start asking people about that, you won't know if what you're saying or doing matches your intention. And you can work with other people, a colleague, friends, etc., to ask them for some specific advice, some feedback. Because I think by understanding how you come across to others, you can then modify or tweak your approaches to develop an effective presence and leadership style. Some people work with coaches, and I've worked with many people on that kind of a style, but you can get that feedback from friends and others. Perhaps even after you give a speech, you would say, well, how'd that come across? Was I too demanding? What was my style like? Okay. So the next area is emotional intelligence. Show of hands, have people heard the term? Are they familiar with it? Okay, great. Many of you have heard of the term. And there's many definitions of that, many books written about it. It's been discussed probably for the last couple of decades. And it is different than IQ, or intelligence quotient. And it essentially means, as it says here, the ability to recognize and understand emotions in oneself and others, and the ability to use this awareness to manage behavior and relationships. So essentially, it's understanding your own emotions and getting control of that in terms of behavior, and then also being able to read the room to get a sense of what's going on. And it's not about being touchy-feely. There's nothing about emotional intelligence that's, oh, this means you have to be nice. It's not about being touchy-feely or nice. It's simply understanding the impact of your emotions and the emotions of others. And it's particularly important for when you're trying to lead change. So a good leader, especially in your roles, without authority, hires subject matter experts. and then use your own people skills to drive results. So this means as a successful leader, you use emotional intelligence along with other tools. And they can be very critical when you're trying to drive change, and here's why. You're going to have people that, that agree with your idea. You're going to have those that are absolutely resistant, and then there's in the middle that will either not, they're not going to get in your way, but they're not going to help you out. But by using emotional intelligence skills, you begin to assess who is in which camp and what do I strategically need to do, who do I need to connect with to move forward, and if so, how do I do that? And we'll talk more about that. So I was trained on, this is the Multi-Health Systems. It has 5 scales, 15 subscales. Others have 4 scales, etc. And you can see self-perception is the first one. The good news is all of these can be grown and developed, and in fact, generally speaking, they're developed throughout our lifetime. So in contrast to personality and IQ, which is relatively fixed at the end of our teenage years, this can be grown. And these are areas that you can be developed so that you're not branded a bully, bossy, or some other B word. I give a whole speech on that other B word. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the subscales just to give you a feel for how emotional intelligence works. The first one is impulse control. So if you're low, you have low impulse control, you're hot-headed, low tolerance for frustration, those are the folks that engage in road rage. Oops. If you're high, you tend to have a lot of impulse control. You kind of get lost in lack spontaneity. You sometimes fail to act, if ever, in this century, or so it feels that way to others. And then in the middle, you're composed and patient. You have the ability to resist impulse, not get caught up in frustration. So I'm going to show you one issue that can come up when you have low impulse control. And this is just a practical example. So for some people, they may either send or receive emails that look like this. Jane, what were you thinking? Were you thinking at all? How could you say that at the meeting? Call me ASAP. Anyone get those kinds of emails or things like that? Okay, maybe not. Well, these things are called flame mail, and they're essentially designed to humiliate, demean, and attack. It's really a form of electronic rage. So if you have well-developed emotional intelligence skills, particularly around impulse control, you make a decision when you get those kinds of emails about whether to respond, when to respond, and how. So in doing so, I like to remind people about this quote from Dr. Viktor Frankl. He's a Holocaust survivor and a noted psychiatrist. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I think about this quote quite a bit because the fact is that we make daily decisions, hundreds of them, and those responses matter. So regardless of whether you have formal authority over somebody or not, your leadership effectiveness is undermined if you react to one of those highly charged emails rather than recognize your emotions and develop an effective response, which considers the whether, when, and how. So if you have low impulse control, you're one of those folks, don't take the bait. You recognize you're upset. You say, I take my hands off the keyboard. You're not going to be a victim. You might want to try taking 3 deep breaths. Get up and walk away from the keyboard so you don't respond. Leave work. Maybe you work somewhere else. But it's most important not to react, but rather to say, I have low impulse control. I tend toward reacting, so I'm going to get up and walk away. So that's just one way in which emotional intelligence can really impact your leadership effectiveness. Flexibility. This is one of the other subscales within emotional intelligence, and it's adapting emotions, thoughts, and behaviors to unfamiliar, unpredictable, and dynamic circumstances. So some people who are really low in that, they're rigid and they're hard to change. They're kind of stuck in patterns. status quo. They adapt poorly to new situations. Then there's the other side, on the other side of the spectrum. Those folks are so flexible, they seem scattered, and they're easily swayed by whoever's speaking to them. And then in the middle, they tend to adapt to changing conditions, open to new views, and these people tend to work with an open mind to ideas and practices. So they'll change their minds, but only when the evidence warrants it. So I use this image of buoys on purpose, and a buoy kind of sits on top of the water, and people can see what's going on. But a buoy can flex depending on the situation. And I'd like you to think about that, being a buoy, to flex to a particular situation. Flexing your behaviors and strategies based on the context will help you achieve your goals. And flexibility can be learned. You can train yourself. So here's a few things to strengthen flexibility. For the less flexible, cultivate an open mind and curiosity and learning. Resist rigid commitment to the past successes, because they generally don't help you succeed in the future. Resist seeking views that just reconfirm your own. And it's getting harder and harder. We do this all the time. Artificial intelligence just keeps sending us things that more which we will like, making it hard for us to get out of our own bubble and going down to the halls to find a buddy who will say, hey, you're doing everything great. But I recommend that you go to those that you know have different views and suck it up and listen to them. And change your mind when it's warranted. For those who are too flexible, evaluate whether your change is rooted in evidence. Communicate the rationale, and I've heard this on Monday, the rationale for change. Communicate the why. So before announcing a change, particularly in an environment where people are used to doing things the way they've always done them, ask yourself, is it reasonably grounded in valid evidence? If so, go ahead and make that change, but explain the why. And then consider small steps. And I know there was some conversation on Monday about looking for pilots, but I also think that even if there is no pilot, taking the right person within your organization to do a pilot, they might be your champions of change. Okay. So relationships and networks, and re-engineering those. As John Maxwell said, good relationships make influence possible. Experts in their field won't get any ideas off the ground unless they start cultivating relationships and networks. Indeed, relationship management, I think, is absolutely the key to effective leadership, regardless of what kind of organization you're in. It's really the ability to inspire and persuade and resolve disagreements. Obviously, if you have good relationships, it's much easier to lead and succeed in those tough times. So recognize that cultivating good relationships when things are calm is a great idea. Don't forget that, because when times get tough, you're going to need those relationships. So as one of my colleagues said, actually he's a head of a nonprofit organization, he had some good advice. He said, friend raising before fundraising. So what does this mean for you? Relationships before asking for tasks to be done. So relationship before tasks. Build your networks and coalitions to achieve your goals. And then you're going to need them in order, and also to build a really broad network, depending on the kind of change you might want to initiate. So interpersonal relationships are a scale as well as a subscale of emotional intelligence. And I don't think that we have time to go through all of those. But I am going to talk to you about what I think is important for you folks as you transition from line judge to presiding judge, or perhaps lawyer into the court administrator position. Regardless, there are 3 different kinds of relationships that you would have with buddies, acquaintances, and your critics. But I did want to talk to you about just some healthy hallmarks of good interpersonal relationships. So think about this. Invest in your relationships. That sounds obvious. And don't be a hog. That also sounds obvious. But make sure it's reciprocal. It doesn't mean it has to be an equal give and take, But don't demand that it always be equal. And those kinds of investments could simply be a listening ear, empathy, providing feedback. Maintain trust. I think that's been discussed a great deal over the last few days, so I won't belabor that point. But it is key to relationships. And if that trust is broken, you're going to have a big uphill battle to get anything done with that person in the future. Maintaining confidences and being honest in communication. And being a connector. And that means understanding who does what within your organization. To use an analogy, when I was managing partner, we had a secretary who was just lousy. I don't think she knew that spell check existed. But she planned great parties. And so when I think about the entire office, I said, let's just let everybody play to their strengths. For the lawyers, some of them were great at marketing, some were great at working up cases, and a few were good at both. But I had each of them play to their strengths. I didn't try to take someone who hates marketing and put him in a marketing event. It wasn't going to work. So truly understanding your organization and letting them play to their strengths and connecting people whose strengths might be compatible. Balancing empathy with organizational goals. And I just mentioned this, empathy is obviously very important, but you need to make sure that you're balancing that with the organizational goals that you have. Use empathy to figure out what motivates, inspires others, and improves a relationship between you and others that you're trying to influence. And then be open to different points of views. And again, I'll say this again, it is getting more and more difficult, especially as we live through polarizing times, and artificial intelligence makes it really hard to go find different points of views because they keep sending you things that you like. And then take responsibility for what happens in your life. You're each responsible, you're not victims. Don't blame others for what happens. Okay. So re-engineering relationships, 3 of them. Let's start with your buddies. Your buddies, your friends, are the ones that you go to lunch with. They're the ones that you confide in, you vent to, and otherwise trust. And they trust you as well. And your relationship with these people was shaped by your prior role. Some of you say, listen, not have said, hey, I'm going to become presiding judge, but I promise you I'm not going to change. I suggest that this promise is unlikely, or this promise, if you make it, is likely to backfire, because one day you're going to need them to do something, and if you don't change, they're going to expect you to give them a pass, engage in poor behavior without consequences, and otherwise expect special treatment. Additionally, if you treat your buddies the same as you had when you were all line judges, others are watching you. And they're going to see that special people get special treatment, and that will make your job all the way around much more difficult. In fact, I don't think you'll be able to be effective with anyone if you've established that special people get special treatment. So your new job means re-engineering those relationships. So here's some strategies and tips to work with your buddies. First, accept the fact that effective leadership means that relationships will change somewhat. You're in a new position, which requires some different behaviors. But that doesn't mean you're a whole new person. It does not mean that you no longer have friendships or buddies. It does not mean that you isolate yourself. In fact, that's the opposite of what you will do if you want to be effective. You can be careful and make some modest changes. So, use your good relationship with your buddies to gain support for your ideas, because there's already that trust and confidence in you. But take some small steps. Don't stop going to lunch with your buddies altogether, but perhaps you might go to lunch with somebody who's not your buddy, somebody either you don't know or you don't like. That might be helpful. I'll talk more about that. Think about how you've influenced them in the past. What's worked? How have you related to them in the past? Are they the chit-chat types? Are they all business, just the facts man type? You can use that. And then you might want to talk to your buddies individually and have frank conversations about your new role. Be forthright about the adjustment, and that you're going to have to establish a new relationship. It won't be completely different, but maybe you talk to them about wearing 2 hats. So when you come to them and ask them to do something, you say, listen, as your friend, I get that you're upset about this or it's going to be time consuming. But as your presiding judge, I need you to get on board with this, but I guess I can give you some more time. But you can't give them a pass. You could also ask them about their objectives and where you can help them. And invite feedback. I think these are folks that can help you. And then rethink your advice network. I deal with this quite a bit when I'm dealing with leaders in all kinds of organizations. They vent to their staff. If they're in a nonprofit organization, they vent to their board. And that's not really helpful. I recommend that you get a new advisory group. And I will tell you that within this organization, you folks might want to get facilitated peer advisory groups together. So by phone, so what I do with a nonprofit group, we actually meet once a month for 3 hours, and I facilitate conversations where they can be completely frank and confidential and help each other solve problems. And you could do this as well by phone, getting people of similar sized court systems together once a month for 3 hours and help each other process through problems that you might have. Those are called peer advisory groups. Okay, acquaintances. Those are folks that are neither friend nor foe. Consider a listening tour. Build trust by deeply listening, understanding their concerns and motives. Acknowledge without criticizing them, and look for common ground. I think looking for common ground is one of the most important things I can tell you today, because if you're always looking for common ground, you'll get some of your goals achieved. And consider an emphasis on consult and then decide, even if you already know what you want to do. With my partnership, I often got asked to make decisions. I get an email from the executives and say, hey, listen, we need an answer. If I didn't need to make a decision right away, and I thought it was something that partners had a thought about, I did send it out for all of their input and invited their input because they were truly my partners. And even if they had agreed with the decision I made, they would resent me if I made it without them. So I'd send it out and say, here's a decision we need to make. Maybe I'd tell them what my thoughts are, but give me your thoughts in the next 24 hours. And at least they felt included. That feeling of being included can make a lot of difference. But, as I think her name was Brianne Edelman said, don't invite that feedback unless you're willing to listen. Okay, critics. This is a tough one. You need specific strategies for your resistors or your critics and competitors. Perhaps some of those people wish they had had your position. So the goal here is not to turn your enemy into your best friend. You're not trying to marry them. Your only goal is trying to work with them effectively. So the goal is to find common ground on which to conduct perhaps just limited, mutually beneficial transactions. So how do you start with that? You're going to have to start with yourself. You're going to have, before you approach a critic or a resistor, examine your own attitudes and behaviors toward this person. Can you get control of them before you speak to them? That will be very important. You need to keep in mind, what's the purpose of my conversation? I just want to achieve a certain goal, or even half of a goal. So that you can keep that in mind as you go into a conversation. Consider spending more time with them. I did that when I was in my partnership. I called it Breaking Bread, and there were some conversations about breakfast with the PJ. I actually went out to some of the folks that I thought were actually my critics and said, let's go to lunch, I'll buy you lunch. And we're not going to even discuss business. Because I think until you can break bread with them, you're not going to get much done. And so perhaps you break bread with them, and then the next time you say, you really talk about your relationship. What went wrong? What can we do to reset this? Obviously recognize your part in the problem and acknowledge it. Perhaps you apologize for it. And listen carefully, and I'll talk more about effective listening. But perhaps using words like, when you say or do X, this is what I'm hearing from you, or this is what I believe you're saying. Is that what you intend? That can often be a very useful tool because oftentimes you've misunderstood them. So asking, when you say this, or behave in this way. This is what I take from it. Is that what you intend? And ask them to do the same back to you. And remember that trust doesn't happen without transparency. You're going to have to build trust step by step. And don't assume that these critics will always be your enemy. I think if you kind of adopt everyone can be an ally approach and just keep trying, again, looking for common ground. Where is it that it's more important for the two of you to collaborate than it is to compete and work in that circle, the areas where collaboration is more important than competition. And show gratitude, just their willingness to show up and have lunch with you. That helps to start resetting that relationship. And start looking for what would be that win-win, or what are their wants, and see if you can do something for them. And as you do this, think about what you need as a minimum, because you might only get half a loaf. So rather than go in with these grandiose goals of, oh my gosh, I'm going to have this best friend at the end of one meeting, can we just break bread in the room? Can we just have lunch with each other and then build up from there? And then just be flexible with your goals depending on how the situation goes. And of course, if you offer to do something for them, you must follow through. That's kind of obvious. So the breaking bread is really what we did with what my first step was as managing partner in my office, because we were working in silos. So I established free lunch Thursday for the partners, and we just ate lunch once a month. Shocking what lawyers will do for a $5 lunch. They all showed up. But once we were able to start breaking bread together and just talking to each other, then we could start working together on mutual goals. So switching subjects, effective communication. Without that, obviously, leadership's impossible. So as you move up in your career, you need to understand that communication, effective communication, and strategically balancing strength and style in the way in which you communicate will take you much farther than your degrees, your experience, or your skills. It really is the key to influencing others and the key to your success. Oops. George Bernard Shaw says the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taking place. So what do I mean by that? So often we think, well, I said this and I was clear. Why didn't you understand that? Well, whether or not a communication, a message is clear and understood, it really has to do with what did the receiver hear, see, or feel. So it's not about what you said, it's about what the receiver heard. So you might think you were clear, but really it's what did the receiver get. So the best way to get your message across as you intended, frankly, is to develop listening skills. And I know that sounds odd to be talking about listening skills in communication, but effective listening is probably one of the most important things you can do. Not only in your role, since you have very little authority over folks, but if you were a leader in any organization. And it's difficult to do because we all have that inner chatter. Perhaps some of you have that going on right now. I'm thinking about getting to the airport, packing my bags, checking out. You have all of that going on. You're checking your phones, etc. And of course, technology does pull us away. So listening is a communication tool, and it is hard work. But this is one area that you have control over, is your own listening skills. So listening is, you listen to understand and not just respond or react, and to develop rapport. So what do I mean by that? So certainly as a lawyer in front of trial judges, I listen to the judge's questions and then reframe my message. And those lawyers who didn't do that probably didn't win. And you might have seen that. People stick to a script and they're not listening to the questions. If you're going to propose something in a meeting and everybody's asking questions about the cost, if you don't hear those questions about cost and reframe it in terms of cost benefit, you're not going to get anyone on board. So it's very important to hear the questions, hear what's going on. The second part, reflective listening. Reflective listening is a very difficult thing to do for some people, but it's absolutely important. Reflective listening is reflect back to people their feelings or paraphrase content. And if you didn't get it right, you can clarify it. But by reflecting back their feelings, they get that you understand them. So, for example, many of us have been at an airport and you're at the gate agent and the plane's delayed. If you go up to the gate agent and get upset, if that gate agent starts defending the airlines, you just keep screaming. If that gate agent says, I know this is frustrating. I can see you're angry. I get that. It will de-escalate the problem. And the same is true for you. When you can paraphrase their feelings or reflect back their feelings and paraphrase content, they do feel heard and understood. And then they'll start listening to you. And as a practical matter, it minimizes those B words that I talked about. So here's some examples. Bob, I see that you're angry or frustrated. Let's talk about this. Or, so if I understand you correctly, the issue is blank. Did I get that right? Or am I on the right track? These are ways to paraphrase or reflect back feelings or paraphrase content. It really helps put things, power down the emotions so that real conversations can take place. Having said that, I'm not saying that reflective listening means agreement at all. And I'm going to talk to you about some specific things that you might be able to say to deal with that. It simply says, I get it. I hear you. I get that you're mad. I get that you're angry about this change. Let's sit down and talk about that. Until you do that, in fact, they're not going to listen to you. And in fact, the more you defend your position, the less likely you will be to achieve your goals. So let me switch to a different thing. Diffusing without agreement. So the person who tried to test me within 48 hours of being managing partner was a fellow who wanted my position. So what did he do? He sent out an email to me, copied to all the partners, complaining about something. His real goal was to see if I would respond like an angry female so that the executive team would realize they had made a mistake and choose him. I didn't take the bait. So this is what I did. First of all, I took my hands off my BlackBerry, which is what I had at the time, and did not immediately respond because I knew whatever that response would be a reaction. So I took my hands off and walked away. But when it was time, I said, Bob, that's an interesting perspective. Or you could say, that's a new perspective. Let's get the group together to discuss it. So he then wrote back a more vitriolic type of email, copied to all the partners. I did not take the bait. Bob, it seems you're really passionate about blank. Let's get the group together to discuss it. Or, Bob, thank you for your feedback and input. Let's get the group together on Friday and make a decision as a partnership. And I know these sound kind of trite, but it really works to not get into an argument, to control it. Or, I appreciate that you've taken an interest in this topic. Or, I appreciate that you've taken the time to write this email. I saw some really long, angry emails. And rather than react to it, I simply said, it looks like you have a great interest in this topic, and you've taken a lot of time to compose that email. So let's get together and talk, and usually that face-to-face or a phone call makes a difference. But I did not engage in an email war. So the keys to effective listening, first of all, be truly present. If your mind has wandered, notice it has wandered. Don't beat yourself up. Bring it back. Ask open-ended questions without judgment. So if somebody is suggesting something, if you start with the problem with that is, or no but, they will eventually stop raising their hand and see you as one of those unreasonable B words. So invite and solicit input without judgment. Use those reflective listening techniques. Listen for what's not being said. I use this a great deal. And that usually is something that I do after I leave a discussion. I think so-and-so didn't raise certain things. I wonder whether it's meaningful or that person has some personal issue in their lives and that's why they're not responding. But I need to double back with that person who didn't raise their hand or didn't have input because maybe something bigger is going on. So I suggest that listening for what's not being said can be as powerful a message as what you're actually hearing the people say in the room. Obviously noticing their nonverbal communications, and I talked about that. And resist your distractors. If you have a phone, there's actually research that shows the mere presence of a cell phone on a table reduces the quality of the relationship. So consider putting away the actual physical phone. So even if it's silenced, its mere presence shows that. And don't make assumptions or offer solutions while hearing the message. Some people are so, I want to get to the solution, I've got a busy day, and rush to solutions. Hear the whole message. Take that time. Because again, you're leading without authority. So if you want to influence, you need to hear the whole message. Listen for some central themes. If everybody's asking you about cost, well, that must be the most important thing on their minds. Address it. Okay, tailoring the message. Understand your audience before you're speaking to them. What kind of method of delivery do they like? What's my relationship to them? Am I their peer, supervisor, trusted advisor? How do they communicate? How do they relate best? Are they one of those chit-chat types? Because if they're one of those chit-chat types, you're going to have to, especially if they're one of your critics and resistors that you're trying to develop rapport with, you're going to have to suck it up and spend the time and be prepared for that. If they're the facts ma'am type, that's all business, that's fine too. So you need to tailor them. But be very careful when you send emails, for example. You've got a bunch of emails to send off. You do very concise emails. It could come across as curt rather than pithy or concise. So think about who you have to humanize a little bit more, an email with or other kind of communication. And then frame the message to the group. If you're talking to the state bar, you want to talk to them about the benefits of whatever your idea is into a lawyer's daily life. Again, if it's about cost, you're talking to the budget people, talk about it in cost benefits. So frame the message to your audience. And then, of course, match the medium with the message. So you're going to use in-person meetings or telephone. I know that sounds difficult in person for the LA County or even Maricopa County, quite frankly. But if you're going to talk about sensitive subjects or emotional topics, and if the goal is really to cultivate relationships, you're going to need to do some personal communications. Email's not going to work. And of course, if you have to deliver a lot of information, perhaps you have a Skype meeting rather than 200 emails back and forth. I don't know how many of you folks have engaged in that when you're trying to get something done. A 15-minute conversation is a lot faster than 200 emails. And of course, you can use emails for routine matters, scheduling, delivering praise that you want everybody to see. But if you send emails, remember the E in email stands for exhibit. It lasts forever. I actually teach this to high school kids as well, and I said if you don't want it, your text message blown up the size of a cafeteria wall, don't hit the send button. So just be careful with that. And I like this advice. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. So just be careful when you're sending that kind of stuff by email. Disagreeing without being disagreeable. This is home stretch here, some other specific strategies. Dealing with disagreement, contrary points of view, and delivering bad news can be tough. And it is actually the one place where most leaders struggle. They end up getting accused of being one of those B words. So beyond using reflective listening techniques, which I've talked to you about, you can diffuse the situation when the other person feels, heard and understood. But start with obvious points of agreement. And I say this, and I think most of you know that, but when you get an email or somebody is arguing with you, if you were to take the time to say, I agree with you on points A, D, and E, that goes a long way to having them hear you when it's time to discuss the other ones that you don't agree with. So start with obvious points of agreement. Point them out. Don't assume that you shouldn't do that because it's faster just to get to the areas of disagreement. It can really make a difference. Give other people's ideas a chance before criticizing. Sometimes that's difficult. If you're one of those people that you find yourself saying no but, be careful. Or if you start every conversation with the problem with that is, what's going to happen is people will stop offering their opinions because you're always going to defend your decision. And if that happens, you're not going to be an effective leader and you won't get your ideas moving forward. So be open to compromise and avoid all or nothing messages, even if it kills you. So I've always tried to live personally and professionally by the pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered theory. Don't be a hog. So remember, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. You don't want to be one. Perhaps you can get most of what you need by striking a middle ground for now, constantly assessing and reassessing the benefits and risks of the deal that's on the table. Determine in advance, though, where you're going to draw that line and walk away. This is obvious. Your mother told you this. Disagree with the idea, don't attack the messenger. But it's always helpful to throw those in. And then thanking others for feedback and input. I think people forget how important that is, that if someone has the guts to stand up and say, I disagree with you or I have some thoughts, when you thank them for that input, it goes a long way to developing a relationship with them. Especially if it's a critic who finally has the guts to stand up and say something, thank them. And then reframe I messages. What I mean by that is, if you were to say, I want the organization to do X, it sounds very self-centered. Reframe it in the context of the organization. So you would say, instead of I want to do X, say X would be good for the organization. And this allows you to assert your voice and not lose your strong presence, but it does increase inclusivity. And I would invite you to, as others have opinions or thoughts, invite them to reframe their messages. Help us understand how this is good for the organization. Okay, home stretch. Some specific strategic steps. Pick your battles wisely. Know when it's worthwhile to agree or disagree. Know when it's time to stop picking a battle. Perhaps you table it in light of the current controversy. And knowing the difference between the two is certainly a skill. But if it's well developed, you will be more effective. Have the meeting before the meeting, and I don't know how many of you folks have talked about this, but the idea that when you want to accomplish something, go to the people that you think are most influential in your organization or in another organization. Test drive your ideas. And if you get positive feedback, get them on board. At the actual big meeting where it's discussed, you'll already have some folks in the room who agree with you. Or if they're going to resist you, better you should find out first. And then you go back to number one. Pick your battles wisely and think about stop picking that battle. So that meeting before the meeting, in fact, several meetings before the meeting, can be, if used strategically, be the most important thing you do to achieve your agenda. Understand others' motivation for a different point of view, and really listening to them. Understand what is their real motivation behind their naysaying. Is they just don't like you, they don't like the idea, or is something else going on? Observe and understand patterns of interaction and influence. And by that I mean, you know who are the key influencers within your organization or other organizations that you need to get on board and start working with them and communicate how you can, again, collaborate on mutually agreeable goals. Be accessible and in touch. I know it's difficult if you have a large, geographically dispersed organization, but you can be accessible in any number of ways. The last thing you're going to do is isolate yourself. It's really hard to understand how to move your organization forward if you really don't know your organization. Be relationship-oriented more so than task-oriented. And this is true at first as you're starting to get things done. If you have something that's important and big, attend to relationships before asking for tasks. So process over task. Sometimes, I was a single mom raising my daughter since she was 8 weeks old alone. But I'll tell you, taking that time to get the process right often made a big difference in the end. So while I knew daycare closed at 6, I still took the time when I could to listen and process, because that process often matters more than the actual decision. And then resist measuring success in units of time. So perhaps you just think about some small thing that you accomplished and say, wow, I raised the bar just that much. Now I'm a little bit higher for me to then proceed to the next step. The other thing you can do is initiate change strategically. So communicate the why, and I know you heard some of this earlier in this meeting. Resist the temptation to just tell them what you need to do. Because when people understand the rationale and understand how it fits into the big picture, they may be more likely to get on board with your ideas. And then actively, obviously, invite creative ideas and input at all levels of the organization that you're trying to influence, to cultivate the sense of ownership amongst everybody. And again, inviting for real. If you're going to invite and ignore, it will backfire. And then don't impose a solution. You certainly will have ideas. But develop it with others. It's okay to develop it as a process. And to advocate, but commit to a desired outcome. But invite peers to participate in the process. It can really make a difference in achieving the outcome you ultimately desire. And I like to start with small goals first. Really tiny steps, like I've talked about just breaking bread, where we're in the same room and just able to say hello. But then if you break things into smaller steps, you can move up and achieve your goals. Perhaps you just identify just one thing you want to achieve and work on that, which will help develop that trust and confidence in you as a leader so that you can then do that more difficult step next. And then, of course, admit when you're wrong. That's obvious, but it might be harder to do for some than others, but it's okay to say, you know what, I messed up. I should have listened more, I should have gotten more feedback. I messed up, and be willing to own it. So, in your leadership style and kind of the organizations that you folks are leading, really you're leading this idea of, the command and control that's out actually in most organizations, but the idea that you're going to move from control to empowering others. Instead of competition, you're going to collaborate and support and move toward that because your leadership will be more effective when encouraging collaboration where it makes sense and to develop that strong network of interdependence and interdependent organizations that come together to achieve shared goals. And of course, you're going to move from success of you to the success of the whole system. And if you measure success of the system rather than yourself, you will again achieve your ultimate goals. Let the best idea win, wherever that idea came from. And here's one: organization-focused to system-focused. And this may or may not relate to your organizations, but some of you, you think about just the judges or just the court system, but you have the state bar, the funders, and all kinds of folks. So if you see yourself as leading a whole system towards some shared goals, you can really make a difference. So the goal is to kind of blend a variety of leadership styles and strategies to leverage those strengths to a particular approach and also to a particular situation. Keep attending to community building while driving results. Establish some clear goals. Think systematically and strategically. Engaging others by matching the best fit to the best fit of talent and interests. And using positive feedback as well. So again, I'm going to leave you with this because I really think the one thing you folks have control over, we all do, is how we respond to something. So we are constantly making decisions about how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. So I suggest that you, as you think about your organizations and how you move your agendas forward, think about each of these. Think thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and then choose your response wisely. And with that, I'm wrapping up, and I think we're just about out of time. I certainly can get questions later, and I have several pages of references and things that might be interested, and I'm happy to send it to each of you. So thank you.